In my decades inside courtrooms, I learned that corruption rarely announces itself with a whisper. It prefers confidence. It prefers volume. It prefers men who believe the weight of their title is heavier than the law itself. But even then, there are moments that stand apart. Moments that etch themselves into memory because they expose just one man's arrogance, but an entire system's weakness. One of those moments began the day a police chief walked into my courtroom and told me, without hesitation, "I run this town." The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. They were delivered calmly, like a statement of fact, the way someone might say the sun rises in the east. He believed it. That belief was the real problem. The morning started like any other. The docket was full, the benches crowded, and the air carried that familiar mixture of boredom and anxiety that lives in every municipal courtroom. Defendants waited for their names to be called. Families sat quietly, rehearsing apologies that might never be spoken. Officers stood near the walls, hands folded, eyes scanning. Nothing suggested that before the day was over, a police chief would leave this building in handcuffs. The case itself seemed ordinary at first. A routine hearing involving a department-related matter that had grown complicated after evidence surfaced of misconduct, paperwork discrepancies, witness statements that didn't align, procedures ignored. The kind of case that reveals itself slowly, layer by layer, if someone is willing to look closely. And I was willing. Then he entered. Police Chief Raymond Hale walked into the courtroom with the posture of a man accustomed to rooms making space for him. His uniform was immaculate, pressed so sharply it looked ceremonial. Metals caught the light when he moved. His expression carried no concern, no uncertainty. It carried ownership. He didn't look at the seal of the court or the bench or the people seated before him. He looked at the room, the way a landlord looks at a property he's come to inspect. People noticed. They always do. There's a subtle shift that happens when authority enters a public space. Conversation's quiet. Back straightened. Some people feel safer. Others feel smaller. Chief Hale understood the dynamic well. He had spent years cultivating it. In his world, presence alone was supposed to end discussions. When his case was called, he approached with confidence that bordered on boredom. He didn't wait for instruction. He stepped forward as if the court existed to accommodate his schedule. His attorney followed closely, carrying himself with the same assured calm, the kind that comes from believing outcomes are negotiable. I asked the routine questions, confirmed names, confirmed roles, confirmed that we were all present for the same matter. Hale nodded along, barely listening, as if the formalities were an inconvenience delaying the inevitable. His eyes drifted toward the gallery, where several civilians sat quietly, including a man who had filed the initial complaint that brought this case into motion. That man, unlike Hale, sat rigidly. His hands were folded tightly in his lap. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't connected. He was just someone who believed the rules applied to everyone. People like him rarely enter courtrooms expecting justice. They enter hoping for fairness, and those are not always the same thing. As the hearing progressed, the tone shifted. Evidence was introduced that contradicted the department's original narrative. Timelines didn't match. Reports had been altered. The body camera video, initially declared a corrupted, had somehow resurfaced intact. With each new detail, the room grew quieter. Chief Hale's expression didn't change. He didn't look worried, he looked annoyed. When I asked him directly about the discrepancies, he leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on the table. His attorney started to speak, but Hale raised a hand, stopping him. That gesture alone told me everything I needed to know about how this man was used to operating. He preferred his own voice. "Your Honor," he said, measured and calm, "let's not pretend we don't understand how things work here." The words landed heavily. He continued, explaining that his department handled complex situations daily, that mistakes on paper didn't equate to misconduct, that his officers acted in the best interest of public safety. All of it delivered smoothly, professionally, almost convincingly. Many smiles. Not a friendly smile, a knowing one. "I've been running law enforcement in this town for over 25 years, he said. "I know the people. I know the system. I know what matters." I asked him to answer the question. That's when his patience ended. He straightened, his voice firming, confidence hardening into something sharper. "With all due respect," he said, "this is my town. I run it. And I'm not going to have my department dragged through the mud over technicalities. The courtroom froze. Some statements reveal character. Others reveal belief. That statement revealed entitlement so complete it no longer recognized limits. He wasn't defending himself. He was asserting dominance. I looked at him for a long moment before responding. Not because I was shocked, but because I wanted him to understand that the room he was standing in did not belong to him. It never had. Chief Hale, I said. This courtroom is not governed by titles. It's governed by the law. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You judge," he replied, "a law isn't enforced by people like me. You might sit on the bench, but without us, the system doesn't function." And there was. The belief laid bare. The idea that enforcement grants ownership, that authority replaces accountability, that power excuses behavior. I asked him one final time to address the evidence. Instead, he leaned back, crossed his arms, and delivered the line that changed everything. "You can push this if you want," he said, "but I run this town, and we both know how this ends." He was wrong. The mistake men like Chief Hale make is assuming silence means agreement. In truth, silence in a courtroom often means calculation. I wasn't considering how to respond emotionally. I was considering how to respond correctly. Authority does not rise to meet arrogance. It outlasts it. I asked the clerk to mark the chief's last statement into the record. That simple request shifted something in the room. Hale noticed it too. His smile faded just slightly. For the first time, he seemed aware that his words carried weight beyond intimidation. The evidence continued. The recovered body camera footage played on the monitor. It showed officers arriving at a scene already shaped by a narrative they hadn't witnessed firsthand. Commands issued before questions were asked. A civilian ordered to step back while attempting to explain what had happened. At one point, a voice off camera could be heard saying, "Clear this up before it gets complicated." The voice was later identified as belonging to a ranking officer directly under Chief Hale. When the video ended, the courtroom remained silent. I asked the chief if he recognized the voices. He hesitated. "Not long, just long enough." "That's my department," he said. Things get said in the heat of the moment." I asked him if those words reflected department policy. He didn't answer. Instead, his attorney stood and attempted to redirect, speaking about years of service, crime reduction statistics, community initiatives, a familiar strata of home accountability with accomplishment. As if past good deeds could erase present wrongdoing, I stopped him. "This court is not weighing a resume," I said. "We are examining conduct." Chief Hale leaned forward again. His composure was cracking now, her irritation leaking through. "You're turning this into something it isn't," he said. "You're embarrassing this department. You're embarrassing the city." The irony was almost painful. I reminded him that the city was not on trial. He was. That's when he stood. Not because he was invited to, because he chose to. Standing gave him height. Height had always worked before. He adjusted his jacket, glanced briefly at the gallery, then fixed his eyes back on me. "Well, let's stop pretending," he said. "Every decision in this town goes through my office one way or another. Permits, security, enforcement. You think any of that happens without my say?" A murmur rippled through the room. People shifted in their seats. Some looked down. Others leaned forward, drawn in by the audacity of what they were hearing. I asked him to sit down. He didn't. "You don't get to lecture me about accountability," he continued. "I've protected this place for decades. I've cleaned up messes you never had to see. That was the moment the case stopped being about misconduct and became about obstruction." I repeated the instruction firmly. "Sit down." "Chief Hale." He shook his head slowly. Disbelief etched across his face. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said. "You judges live in theory. I live in reality." Reality in his mind was power unchecked. I informed him that he was now disregarding a direct order of the court. That got his attention. He sat down abruptly, anger flashing across his face. His hands clenched, his jaw tightened. The confidence he carried in with him was unraveling, replaced by frustration and something close to panic. But instead of retreating, he doubled down. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "People depend on me. You push this too far, things get messy." It was a threat, carefully worded but unmistakable. I asked the court reporter to read back his last statement. As the words echoed back to him, stripped of tone and context, Reduced to text on a page, their meaning became impossible to deny. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I leaned forward. "Chief Hale," I said, "do you understand what obstruction of justice is?" He scoffed. "This is ridiculous." I explained it anyway, slowly, clearly. Not for him, but for the record. Interfering with judicial proceedings, using position to influence outcomes, attempting to intimidate a court. With each definition, his expression darkened. He interrupted me mid-sentence. "I told you," he snapped, his voice rising. "Now, I run this town." That was it. The law does not negotiate with threats. It responds to them. I signaled to the bailiff. The movement was subtle, but the effect was immediate. The bailiff stepped forward. The gallery stirred. Hale looked around, confused, as if trying to recalibrate the situation. "Chief Hale," I said, "you are being held in contempt of court." His face flushed. "You can't be serious." "I am." His attorney stood quickly protesting, citing procedure, requesting recess. I denied it. "This court will not be threatened," I continued, "and it will not be bullied." Hale laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "You don't have the authority," he said. "I do. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so dangerous. I instructed the bailiff to contact state authorities immediately. Not local, state. That's when the realization hit him. He wasn't used to operating outside his own chain of command. He wasn't used to people he couldn't influence stepping in. His power had always relied on proximity, on familiarity, on fear. State troopers arrived within minutes. They didn't rush. They didn't posture. They walked in calmly, professionally, and approached the bench for instruction. Hale watched them, eyes darting, trying to read faces that gave him nothing. I stated the charges clearly. Obstruction, intimidation of a judicial officer, contempt. The lead trooper turned to Hale. "Chief Raymond Hale," he said. "Please stand." Hale didn't move. I said, "Stand," the trooper repeated. Slowly, reluctantly, Hale rose. The room was silent now in a way that felt final. No murmurs, no shifting, just attention. "We're under arrest," the trooper said. Hale's mouth opened and closed. He looked toward the gallery, searching for something familiar, something loyal. Handcuffs changed the way a room breathes. The moment the trooper secured them around Chief Hale's wrists, something intangible shifted. Power that had once filled the space evaporated, replaced by a silence so complete it felt ceremonial. This was no longer a courtroom debating authority. It was a courtroom witnessing consequence. Hale stood rigid, shoulders tight, eyes locked forward as if refusing to acknowledge what was happening to him. The uniform that once commanded respect now looked like a costume stripped of meaning. The medals that had caught the light earlier now seemed heavy, burdensome, reminders of promises broken rather than service honored. His attorney protested again, louder this time, arguing process, jurisdiction, demanding immediate release. The troopers didn't respond. They had heard it all before. Words lose their power when law replaces influence. As Hale was escorted toward the side exit, it's enough to meet my eyes. There was no apology there, no reflection, only disbelief. The kind that comes from a man encountering a reality he never imagined applying to him. "You're making an enemy," he said quietly. I didn't answer. Judges don't need enemies. We need order. The troopers let him out. The doors closing behind them with a finality that echoed through the room. For a moment, no one spoke. The gallery remained frozen, unsure whether they had just witnessed justice or something they weren't supposed to see at all. Then the murmurs began. People whispered to one another, voices low but urgent. Some shook their heads. Others nodded slowly, absorbing the significance of what had occurred. A few looked stunned, as if a myth they'd lived with for years had just been shattered in front of them. I called the room back to order. "This hearing is adjourned," I said, my voice steady. "Further proceedings will follow." The gavel came down, but the weight of the moment lingered long after its sound faded. Outside the courtroom, the impact rippled outward. News traveled fast. It always does when power falls publicly. By the time I returned to chambers, my clerk informed me that reporters were already gathering. Phone lines were lighting up. City officials were requesting statements. The machinery of consequence had begun to turn. Within hours, details emerged that painted a picture far darker than the case that initially brought Hale into my courtroom. Internal affairs reports long buried. Complaints quietly dismissed. promotions inexplicably granted, a pattern of intimidation that had kept officers silent and civilians compliant. The phrase, "I run this town," began appearing in headlines. By the next morning, the mayor held a press conference announcing Hale's immediate suspension. The city council called for an independent investigation. Officers who had once avoided speaking out began coming forward, their testimonies forming a chorus that could no longer be ignored. What surprised many was not that corruption existed, but how long it had been allowed to thrive. Power, when left unchallenged, becomes comfortable with itself. It stops questioning, stops listening, stops fearing consequence. Hale wasn't unique. He was inevitable in a system that rewarded loyalty over integrity. Days later, I reviewed the formal charges brought against him. They were extensive: obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, coercion, evidence tampering. Each count represented not just a legal violation, but a human cost. Lives altered, trust eroded, faith diminished. During his arraignment, Hale looked smaller, not physically, but spiritually. The confidence was gone, replaced by something brittle and defensive. He pleaded not guilty, his voice tight, his eyes avoided the gallery. This time, he did not speak out of turn. The town responded in its own way. Some expressed outrage, calling the arrest overdue. Others defended Hale, insisting his intentions had been good, that he'd simply played the game the way it had always been played. Change rarely arrives without resistance. But something else happened too. People began to talk. Civilians shared stories of stops that felt wrong. Officers admitted to orders they'd questioned but obeyed. Business owners described these suggestions that had felt more like commands. Each story added another thread to a tapestry of misconduct that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. Accountability, once introduced, has a way of spreading. I received letters. Some thanked me. Others accused me of overreach. One anonymous note warned me to watch my back. I forwarded it to security and returned to my work. Fear cannot be allowed to dictate justice. The moment it does, the law becomes optional. Weeks passed, investigations deepened, a federal task force became involved. Subpoenas were issued, records seized. Hale's inner circle began to fracture under scrutiny. Loyalty dissolved quickly when protection disappeared. Eventually, he returned to court for a preliminary hearing on the broader charges. He entered without fanfare this time. No uniform. No medals. Just a man in a suit, escorted by officers who treated him as they would anyone else. As he stood before the bench, I noticed something I hadn't before. His hands trembled slightly. The prosecutor outlined the evidence methodically. Financial records showing unexplained deposits. Communications suggesting coordinated efforts to suppress complaints. Testimony from officers who had been threatened with reassignment or termination if they didn't comply. Hale's attorney objected repeatedly, but the foundation was solid. This was no longer about interpretation. It was about proof. When asked if he wished to address the court, Hale hesitated. The pause stretched long enough to draw attention. Finally, he spoke. "I served this town," he said. "I kept it safe." The statement hung in the air, incomplete. Service, I thought, is not measured by control. It's measured by restraint. I reminded him that the court would determine responsibility, not intention, that service does not grant immunity. That leadership without accountability is simply domination by another name. He said nothing more. The hearing concluded with Hale being remanded pending trial. As he was led away, I watched the room. No cheers, no applause, just quiet observation. Justice, when done correctly, does not require celebration. It requires acceptance. Later that evening, as the courthouse emptied and the lights dimmed, I reflected on the events that had unfolded. Not with satisfaction, but with clarity. The law had functioned as it was meant to, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but effectively. A man who believed he ran the town had learned a fundamental truth. No one runs justice. The weeks that followed revealed how deeply one man's arrogance had shaped an entire culture. As investigators pulled thread after thread, the illusion of order that Chief Hale had cultivated unraveled quickly. What emerged wasn't chaos, but truth. And truth, when exposed, has a way of forcing institutions to choose between reform and collapse. The department entered a period of reckoning. Interim leadership was installed. Outside auditors reviewed policies that had gone untouched for years. Training manuals were rewritten. Reporting structures were redesigned to ensure no single voice could silence others again. These changes didn't come easily. Some officers resisted. Others welcomed them with relief, but bordered on exhaustion. I heard from officers who admitted they had stayed quiet, not because they agreed with Hale, but because they believed resistance was pointless. They had families to support, careers to protect. Speaking up felt like professional suicide. Corruption doesn't survive because everyone supports it. It survives because too many people believe they're powerless to stop it. One letter stayed with me. It came from a patrol officer who joined the force straight out of college. He wrote about the first time he'd been instructed to adjust a report to make an incident disappear. He remembered the knot in his stomach, the unease he couldn't shake. When he questioned it, a supervisor had laughed and told him, "This is how things are done here." He wrote that watching Hale get arrested changed something in him. Not because it proved corruption existed, but because it proved it could be confronted. That letter mattered more to me than any headline. Hale's trial became the focal point of the town's attention. Court dates were packed. Reporters filled the benches. Citizens lined up early, not for spectacle, but for reassurance. They wanted to see whether accountability would hold or crumble under pressure. Hale's defense was predictable. He claimed misunderstandings, rogue subordinates, political targeting. He painted himself as a scapegoat sacrificed to public outrage. He spoke often of his years of service, of crime rates reduced, of neighborhoods stabilized. But service does not erase abuse. It does not excuse intimidation. And it does not permit a man to place himself above the law. Witness after witness testified. Officers described orders given behind closed doors. Civilians recounted complaints that vanished without explanation. Analysts explained patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Each testimony chipped away constructed time. When it was his turn to testify, Hale chose confidence over humility. He spoke firmly, denying wrongdoing, insisting his decisions were misunderstood. He framed his actions as leadership, his control as necessity. At one point, he repeated the phrase that had become infamous. "While I ran this town," he said, someone had to. The prosecutor didn't interrupt. She let the words hang, then she asked a single question. "Who gave you that authority?" Hale hesitated. The pause was longer this time. He glanced at his attorney, then back at the jury. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally answered, "I earned it." The courtroom was silent. Authority in a democracy is not earned. It is granted, temporarily, conditionally, and it can be taken away. The verdict came weeks later. Guilty on multiple counts. The sentence reflected not just the crimes, but the damage done. Prison time, forfeiture of pension, permanent separation from law enforcement. The uniform that once symbolized trust was now evidence of betrayal. When sentencing concluded, Hale stood quietly, eyes downcast. For the first time since I had known him, he said nothing. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated. Others mourned the fall of a man they once admired. Both responses were understandable. Justice does not require unanimity. It requires integrity. The town changed after that. Not overnight, not perfectly, but noticeably. Complaint processes became transparent. Oversight committees gained real authority. Officers attended training sessions focused not just on enforcement, but ethics. Citizens felt more empowered to speak. Trust, once fractured, began the slow process of repair. I won't pretend one case fixed everything. It didn't. No single decision ever does. But it set a precedent. It reminded everyone watching that power has boundaries, and when those boundaries are crossed, consequences follow. Years later, I still think about the moment Hale told me he ran the town, not with anger, with clarity, because that belief, more than any crime, was his undoing. The belief that position equals permission. That influence replaces law. That fear can substitute for respect it can't. Courts exist to draw lines, to say where authority ends and accountability begins. Those lines must be defended not because judges are infallible, but because the alternative is ruled by intimidation. I often tell young attorneys and new judges that courage in this job doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like restraint. And sometimes it looks like refusing to back down when someone tells you they own something that was never theirs to begin with. Power doesn't make someone untouchable. It makes them responsible. When a police chief tells a judge he runs the town, he isn't asserting strength. He's confessing weakness. He's admitting that without unchecked authority, he has nothing. Justice doesn't belong to any one person. It doesn't belong to a badge, a title, or a reputation. It belongs to the people it serves. And when someone forgets that, the law remembers for them. That is how a man who believed he controlled everything learned the one truth he had avoided his entire career. No one runs the law.